The iron spade rang against the frozen earth. Each strike sent a shock-wave of cold up the hickory handle, through Elias's wool mittens, and into the bones of his arms. It was a high, brittle sound in the late autumn air, a sound that promised winter was not coming, but was already here, waiting just beneath the surface of things. Beside him, a great black dog with intelligent amber eyes sat patiently, his breath pluming in white clouds that vanished almost as soon as they appeared. The dog, Barrow, shifted his weight from one paw to another, a silent question in the movement. Elias paused, drove the spade into the unyielding ground, and rested his hands on the worn wood. He looked at the hole. It was not much of a hole yet, barely a foot deep and 4 feet wide, a crude scar on the sloping hill behind the small cabin his father had built. "It'll work," Elias said, his voice quiet, swallowed by the vast, cold silence of the valley. Barrow whined softly, a low note of agreement, and nudged a cold nose against his master's leg. From the path below, another sound intruded, the crunch of boots on frosted gravel. Elias didn't need to look. He knew the heavy, certain tread of his neighbor. Mr. Gable was a man carved from the same timber as the mountains, weathered and unbending. He stopped at the edge of the digging, his hands on his hips, his face a mask of profound disbelief. "What in creation are you doing, boy?" Gable's voice was a gravelly rumble. "The ground's hard as bedrock. You'll break your back and your shovel before you get anywhere. What's the point of all this?" Elias pulled the spade free and chipped away another sliver of frozen soil. "Building." Gable snorted, a sharp, dismissive sound. "Building what? A grave? Because that's what you'll find out here if you don't get some sense into that head of yours. Your father, bless his soul, was a dreamer. Looks like you've inherited the affliction. This is the North, son. You don't fight it. You board up your windows, you stack your wood high, and you pray the winter is short. You don't go digging holes in the ground like a badger." He gestured with a thumb toward Elias's woodpile, which was indeed stacked high, nearly to the eaves of the cabin. "You've done the sensible work. Why spoil it with this foolishness?" "I have a plan," Elias said. He didn't elaborate. He knew it wouldn't matter. Explanations were just words, and words were cheap things in this thin air. Only work had weight. Only results could speak. "A plan," Gable repeated, shaking his head. He pulled his collar tighter around his neck. "A plan to catch your death of a cold, more like. You're digging a mudroom in November. That's the craziest thing I've ever seen. Wait until the first real snow. That hole will be nothing but a drift. Wait until the thaw, and it'll be a pond. You're inviting the damp right into your foundation." He stared for another long moment, then turned away. "Don't say I didn't warn you." The crunch of his boots faded. Elias watched him go, a stout figure retreating down the path, a living embodiment of conventional wisdom. He looked back at the hole, then at Barrow. The dog looked from the hole to Elias, his tail giving a single, slow thump against the ground. Trust. It was all the encouragement Elias needed. He picked up the spade and went back to work, the rhythmic ringing of steel on stone the only answer to his neighbor's doubt. That night, by the light of a tallow candle, Elias sat at his father's small writing desk. The cabin was silent save for the crackle of the fire and the soft snores of Barrow at his feet. Open before him was a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with his father's elegant, precise script and intricate diagrams. He wasn't a dreamer, as Gable had called him. He was an engineer, a student of the natural world who saw solutions where others saw only problems. Elias ran a finger over a drawing. It showed a cross-section of a hill, much like the one behind the cabin. Nestled within it was a stone-lined chamber, connected to the main house by a short, insulated tunnel. Arrows indicated airflow, heat circulation, and the dissipation of moisture. His father had called it the winter womb. A structure that didn't fight the cold but used it. A shelter that drew on the deep, constant temperature of the earth itself to create a pocket of enduring warmth. The entry was dated 10 years prior. "The earth's insulation is perfect," his father had written. "At a depth of 6 feet, the temperature remains remarkably stable, a constant near 40 degrees, regardless of the fury on the surface. Snow, the great enemy, can become the greatest ally. A blanket, not a blade." A layer of packed snow, 3 feet thick, has the insulative value of 6 inches of solid wood. The mistake is to build up, into the wind. The wisdom is to build down, into the quiet heart of the winter. Elias closed the journal. He had read these pages 100 times. He knew the plans by heart. Tomorrow he would need the pickaxe. The ground would only get harder. He banked the fire, checked the locks on the door, and lay down on his cot. Outside, the wind began to moan around the eaves, a low, hungry sound. It was the sound of the coming test. He closed his eyes, not with fear, but with a quiet, unshakable resolve. The work had begun. The days that followed fell into a grueling rhythm, dictated by the rising and setting of a pale, indifferent sun. Elias rose before dawn, ate a quick meal of oats and dried fruit, and went out into the biting cold. He worked until his muscles screamed and the light failed, stopping only for a midday meal of bread and salted pork, which he shared with Barrow. The hole grew slowly, agonizingly. He broke the frozen topsoil with the pickaxe, its sharp point biting into the earth with a jarring thud, then shoveled the loosened dirt and rock onto a growing mound beside the excavation. His hands, even protected by leather gloves, were soon a geography of blisters and calluses. His back ached with a deep, permanent fire. Mrs. Gable began visiting every few days, a worried crease between her brows. She would bring a steaming bowl of stew or a fresh loaf of bread wrapped in cloth. "Elias, you're looking thin as a fence post," she'd say, her voice laced with a gentle, frustrated concern. "This obsession, it's not healthy. You need to rest. Let the earth rest." "I'm fine, Mrs. Gable. Thank you for the food." "Your father was a good man, but he had ideas. Strange ideas. A man can't live on ideas alone. He needs a roof, a fire, and the company of his neighbors." "This will be a roof," Elias would reply, gesturing to the deepening pit. "And it will have a fire." She would just shake her head and leave the food on the porch rail, a small offering to a madness she couldn't comprehend. The other townsfolk kept their distance. They'd watch from the road as they passed, small figures bundled against the cold, sometimes pointing, their words lost to the wind but their meaning clear. The orphan boy, digging his own folly on the hill. Mayor Thompson, a man whose wealth was measured in timber and whose patience was measured in minutes, stopped his sleigh one afternoon. "Elias," he boomed, not bothering to dismount. "Gable tells me you're digging a root cellar. A bit late in the season for that, isn't it? And you're piling the dirt up like an eyesore. It devalues the whole valley, this mess. Clean it up, son. Focus on practical matters." "It's not a root cellar," Elias said, his breath misting. "Whatever it is, it's a waste of good daylight. We've got a long winter ahead. You should be trapping, not playing in the dirt." With a flick of the reins, the mayor was gone, leaving only the jingle of harness bells and a faint scent of expensive tobacco on the air. Elias ignored them all. Their words were like the wind. You could feel them, but they couldn't stop you. He had the journals. He had the plan. He had his father's voice on every page, a quiet counter-argument to the chorus of doubt. He reached the 6-foot depth he needed for the main chamber in the 3rd week of November. The earth at the bottom was different, cooler, certainly, but softer, free of the iron grip of the frost. It smelled of damp stone and ancient quiet. Now the 2nd phase began, construction. He owned a small plot of wooded land up the valley, a legacy from his father along with the cabin. Each morning he and Barrow would make the 2-mile trek. He felled pine and oak with a precision born of long practice, the axe strokes echoing in the silent woods. He chose the trees himself, judging the grain, the straightness, the lack of disease. He was not clear-cutting, he was harvesting, taking only what he needed, leaving the forest healthy. He learned the art of it from the journals. "A forest is a community," his father wrote. "Take from it with respect, and it will provide for you forever." He used a small handsaw to cut the logs into beams and planks, a slow, laborious process that left him covered in sawdust and sweat, even in the freezing air. He dragged the timbers back to the cabin one by one, using Barrow as a sled dog of sorts, harnessing the patient animal to help pull the heavier loads across the frozen ground. The growing pile of lumber near the hole was a testament to his tireless effort. It was during this time that he first truly met Elara. He had seen her in the village, of course. She was the blacksmith's daughter, with a quiet strength about her that he recognized. She didn't mock or whisper like the others. One afternoon, she walked up the path, not with a bowl of soup or a lecture, but with a simple, genuine curiosity in her eyes. She stopped and watched him for a long time as he worked on fitting the first foundation stones, rocks he'd hauled from the creek bed, into the base of the pit. "That's a dry stack wall," she said, her voice clear and soft. He looked up, surprised. "Yes. My father uses them for his forges. It takes a good eye to fit them so they don't shift." She gestured to the stones. "You have a good eye." Elias felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the physical exertion. He wiped a hand across his forehead, leaving a smear of dirt. "My father taught me." "In his journals." She nodded, her gaze taking in the entire project, the deep hole, the piles of stone and timber, the patient dog. She didn't ask what it was for. Instead, she asked, "How will you keep the water out in the spring?" It was the first intelligent question anyone had asked him. It was a question of process, not of purpose. It assumed competence. "A French drain," he said, finding himself wanting to explain. "A trench filled with gravel, sloped away from the foundation, and the walls will have a layer of clay on the outside. It's waterproof when it's packed tight." "And the roof?" "Heavy beams, 2 layers of planks, then thick sod, cut from the meadow before the freeze. The grass roots will hold it together. It will be alive." She looked at the sky, where gray clouds were gathering in a thick, bruised line on the horizon. "The snow will be here soon." "I know," he said. "I'll be ready." She smiled, a small, knowing smile. "I believe you will be." She didn't stay long, but her visit was a turning point. It was a single note of harmony in a symphony of discord. It made the work feel less solitary, the purpose less private. Someone else saw not a madman digging a hole, but a craftsman laying a foundation. He worked with renewed vigor. The stone walls rose steadily, each rock chosen and placed with care, fitting into its neighbors like a piece of a complex puzzle. He was not just building a structure. He was having a conversation with the materials, with the land, with the memory of his father. He learned the language of the stone, the give of the wood, the heft of the earth. He built the heavy timber frame for the roof, hoisting the massive beams into place with a system of levers and ropes, a slow, dangerous dance of gravity and mechanics. Barrow would watch, whining with anxiety whenever a beam swayed precariously, then settling down once it was secured. By the first week of December, the main structure was complete. The stone walls stood firm. The heavy roof was in place, covered in 2 layers of thick oak planks. He spent 3 days hauling the sod he had cut in October, laying it carefully over the planks like a thick, living blanket. From a distance, it looked as though the hill had simply grown a slight rectangular bulge. He built the tunnel connecting the chamber to the back wall of his cabin's small pantry, framing and insulating it with packed wool and sawdust. He cut a heavy door from a single slab of oak, 3 inches thick, and fitted it with iron hinges Alara's father forged for him, the blacksmith asking no questions, only charging a fair price. Inside, the chamber was about 12 feet by 16 feet. It was dark and smelled of earth and freshly cut wood. He built a small, efficient stove in one corner, venting it through a clever, triple-walled pipe that rose through the roof and was designed to stay clear of snow. He built shelves into the walls, a sturdy table, and 2 simple bunks. He moved his winter provisions into the chamber, sacks of flour, beans and potatoes, salted fish and cured meats, crates of apples and jars of preserves. He stacked firewood along one entire wall, enough to last for months. Mr. Gable made one last visit before the snows began in earnest. He peered into the finished tunnel from the pantry. "A mudroom," he said, the word dripping with a month's worth of accumulated scorn. "You spent 2 months of back-breaking labor to build a fancy mudroom. All that work for a place to put your wet boots." He shook his head, a final, weary gesture of pity. "You'll be cold in that cabin, son, just like the rest of us. But I suppose you'll have the driest boots in the valley." Elias simply nodded. "I'll be warm." 2 days later, the first snowflakes began to fall. They were not the gentle, picturesque flakes of storybooks. They were small and hard, like grains of sand, driven by a wind that had a new and vicious edge to it. The sky, which had been gray for weeks, turned a flat, luminous white. There were no clouds, only a seamless, oppressive ceiling of snow. The old-timers called it a sky of iron. It was a sign. Elias did one last check. The stove in the chamber drew perfectly. The shelves were stocked. The wood was dry. He brought Barrow inside, closing and bolting the heavy oak door to the outside world, then sealing the connecting door to the pantry. He lit a lantern. The small chamber was filled with a soft, steady glow. It was quiet. The wind, which had been a constant howl around the cabin, was now just a distant, muffled whisper. He put a log in the stove and lit it. Within minutes, a deep, gentle warmth began to fill the space. Barrow circled 3 times on a pile of old blankets in the corner and settled with a contented sigh. Elias sat at the table, opened his father's journal, and waited. The storm could have the world outside. He had this. This was his home. The snow fell for a day, then 2, then 3. It fell without pause, a relentless vertical river of white that erased the world. The familiar shapes of the valley, the fences, the trees, the neighboring cabins, vanished one by one, buried beneath a rising tide. The wind joined the assault, shrieking like a banshee, sculpting the endless snow into monstrous drifts, burying houses to their eaves, shearing branches from ancient oaks. The temperature plummeted. It dropped to 10 below, then 20, then a soul-crushing 30 degrees below zero. It was a cold that split wood and cracked stone. It was a cold that sought out every chink in a home's armor, every crack in a man's resolve. Inside the winter womb, it was still. The only sounds were the soft crackle of the fire, the whisper of Elias's pencil as he sketched in a notebook, and the gentle rhythm of Barrow's breathing. The air was warm, a steady 65 degrees. The stone walls, warmed by the stove and insulated by 6 feet of earth and now 10 feet of snow, radiated a gentle, even heat. The ventilation system, a pair of baffled pipes his father had designed, drew fresh air in and expelled smoke and stale air without creating a draft. It was a perfect, self-sustaining ecosystem of warmth and safety. Elias would occasionally climb a small ladder to a periscope-like viewing port he had built into the roof, a simple wooden tube with angled pieces of polished tin. Through it, he could see the storm's fury. The world outside was a maelstrom of white, a chaotic, featureless blur. There was no sky, no ground, only the violent dance of wind and snow. It was like looking out from a ship submerged in a raging, frozen sea. He felt no fear, only a profound sense of vindication. His father's words were true. The snow was a blanket. The earth was an anchor. The plan had worked. He and Barrow maintained a simple routine. They ate, they slept, they kept the fire fed. Elias read his father's journals, not for instruction anymore, but for company. He felt a deep connection to the man who had foreseen this, the man whose quiet genius was now the only thing standing between him and the white death outside. He tended to his tools, sharpening his axe and oiling his saws. He felt a deep, abiding peace. He had prepared, he had labored, and now he was secure. On the 4th day of the storm, a new sound intruded. It was faint at first, nearly lost in the muffled roar of the wind. A desperate, rhythmic banging. It was coming from the connecting tunnel, from the door to the cabin's pantry. Barrow's head shot up, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Elias quieted him with a hand. He stood and listened. The banging came again, frantic and weak. He unlatched the heavy inner door and moved into the short tunnel. The sound was louder here. It was coming from the cabin. Someone had managed to get inside his house. He drew the heavy bolts on the pantry door and pulled it open. A figure, caked in snow and ice, collapsed into the tunnel. It was Mr. Gable. His face was a mask of frozen agony, his beard a solid block of ice. His breath came in ragged, tearing gasps.
"Elias,"
he choked, his voice a raw whisper.
"The roof, the weight of the snow, it came down. The whole north side of the house, gone."
Elias didn't hesitate. He pulled his neighbor into the warmth of the main chamber, shutting and bolting the door behind them, sealing out the tendrils of ferocious cold that had followed him in. He sat the trembling man by the stove and wrapped him in thick wool blankets. Barrow, his initial suspicion gone, came and licked the man's frozen hand.
"My wife,"
Gable rasped, his eyes wild with fear.
"She's with the Thompsons. We thought their big house would be safer, but we can't hear anything from them now. The snow is over the windows."
As if on cue, the muffled banging started again. This time it was on the main outer door, the one that opened directly to the hillside. Elias looked at Gable, whose face was a mixture of terror and dawning comprehension. Elias unbolted the 3-inch oak slab. It took all his strength to push it open against the pressure of the snow that had drifted against it. A small group of figures huddled in the stairwell he had dug, their faces barely visible behind scarves thick with ice. It was Mayor Thompson, his wife, and Mrs. Gable, who rushed to her husband's side with a cry of relief. Behind them were Elara and her father, the blacksmith.
"Our roof is groaning,"
the mayor said, his usual booming voice reduced to a humbled plea.
"The main beam is cracked. It's going to go. We saw your stovepipe. It was the only smoke we could see."
"Come in," Elias said simply. "All of you." He helped them inside, one by one, into the impossible warmth and quiet of the chamber. They stood there, blinking in the lantern light, their faces etched with shock and disbelief. They looked at the stone walls, the stacked firewood, the shelves of food. They looked at the steady, efficient stove. They felt the gentle, enveloping warmth. Mrs. Gable began to weep quietly. Mayor Thompson, the man who had called this project an eyesore, slowly removed his hat, his gaze sweeping across the room. He looked at Elias, and for the first time, there was no condescension in his eyes, only a raw, unvarnished awe. Alara met Elias's gaze across the crowded room. She wasn't surprised. Her expression was the same one she'd worn that first day, quiet, knowing trust. She gave him a small, weary smile that spoke volumes. The small chamber, built for one man and his dog, was now a sanctuary for 9. It was crowded, but it was safe. Elias passed around mugs of hot, sweet tea, and the survivors huddled together, sharing blankets and body heat, the terror of the storm slowly receding as the deep, earthy warmth of the shelter seeped into their bones. Mr. Gable sat on a low stool, his hands wrapped around his mug, staring into the flames of the stove. He looked up at Elias, his eyes clear now, filled with a terrible, hard-won clarity.
"I was a fool, son," he said, his voice thick with emotion.
The entire room fell silent.
"A damned old fool. I mocked you. I called your work madness."
He gestured around the small, warm room, at the solid walls, the sturdy roof.
"This isn't madness. This is the sanest place in the whole world."
Elias looked at the old man, at the faces of his neighbors, all of them stripped of their pride and their certainty, reduced to the simple, elemental need for shelter.
"You're safe now," he said.
It was all that needed to be said. They were a community, huddled together against the end of the world, kept alive by the unconventional wisdom of a man they had called a dreamer and the quiet persistence of his son. The storm could rage. They would endure. The blizzard, which would forever be known in the valley's history as the Great White Death, lasted for 7 days. For 3 of those days, 9 people and 1 dog lived in the winter womb. The world outside ceased to exist. Their universe shrank to the dimensions of the stone-walled room, a pocket of life buried deep within the snow. The initial shock and terror gave way to a quiet, communal rhythm. Elias, without claiming leadership, became the calm center around which they all revolved. He rationed the food, ensuring everyone had 2 simple but hot meals a day. He kept the fire perfectly banked, never too hot, never too low. He spoke little, but his steady presence was a constant reassurance. The social structures of the village dissolved in the lantern-lit warmth. Mayor Thompson, a man used to giving orders, became just another person grateful for a bowl of bean soup. The blacksmith, a man of few words like Elias, helped reinforce a section of the shelving. The women, Mrs. Gable and Mrs. Thompson, organized the blankets and kept their small living space tidy, creating a sense of order in the chaos. Ilara was a quiet force, helping Elias, comforting the others, her calm demeanor a balm to frayed nerves. They told stories to pass the time, their voices low and intimate in the enclosed space. They spoke of past winters, none of which compared to this one. They spoke of their fears, their hopes, their families. They were no longer just neighbors, they were survivors, bound by a shared ordeal and a common debt. On the 8th morning, they awoke to a profound silence.
The eternal, muffled roar of the wind was gone. Elias climbed the ladder to his viewing port. He looked out not on a swirling vortex of white, but on a world transformed, pristine, and blindingly bright under a newly cleared, pale blue sky. The snow had stopped. It took 4 of them, Elias, Gable, Thompson, and the blacksmith, 2 hours to clear the snow from the entryway and force the heavy door open. They emerged into a landscape of impossible beauty and devastation. The snow was 15 feet deep on the level, with drifts that rose 30 or 40 feet, burying entire cabins. Only the tallest pines and the steepest rooftops were visible. The valley was a soft, undulating sea of white, silent and still. It was a new world, sculpted by the storm. The destruction was immense. Gable's home was a ruin, its roof and north wall completely collapsed. The mayor's grand house had held, but the great beam in the main room had indeed splintered, and the weight of the snow threatened to bring it down at any moment. Half the homes in the village were damaged or completely buried. Livestock had frozen in the barns. The community was shattered. But the people in Elias's shelter were alive. In the days that followed, the shelter became the command center for the valley's recovery. Using it as a warm, safe base, the survivors began the arduous task of digging out their neighbors. They found other survivors, people who had weathered the storm in their root cellars or in the miraculously undamaged church. But they also found loss. 5 souls had been lost to the storm, victims of collapsed roofs or the killing cold. The entire valley mourned. In the wake of the Great White Death, a fundamental shift occurred. The mockery that had surrounded Elias's project was replaced by a deep and abiding respect. He was no longer the foolish orphan boy. He was the quiet savior of the valley. People came to him, not with pity or scorn, but with questions. They brought him salvaged paper and charcoal sticks, asking him to draw the plans for his shelter. They wanted to understand the principles of the French drain, the sod roof, the ventilation system. Elias, using his father's journals as a guide, taught them. He didn't lecture, he showed them. He walked them through the principles of working with the land, not against it. He explained how the earth's warmth was a constant, how snow could be an ally. He shared his father's wisdom freely and quietly. That spring, as the great melt began, the people of the valley did not just rebuild. They rebuilt differently. Small, semi-subterranean shelters, based on Elias's design, began to appear on the hillsides behind many of the cabins. They became known as hearthholds, and their construction became a communal effort. The project that had once been an object of ridicule was now the blueprint for their collective survival. Elias and Alara were married the following autumn, in a simple ceremony in the newly repaired church. Their life together was woven into the fabric of the recovering community. They had 2 children, a son and a daughter, who grew up playing on the soft, grassy roof of the hearthhold that had saved their mother. Elias never sought a position of power. He never became mayor or a man of wealth, but he became the valley's anchor. When a dispute arose, people sought his quiet counsel. When a difficult decision had to be made, they asked for his opinion. He was their repository of practical wisdom, the man who had proven that the quietest voice often holds the deepest truth. Years passed. The seasons turned. The hearthhold was expanded, a second chamber added, a small workshop for Elias. It became not just an emergency shelter, but the heart of the community. In the winter, children would gather there to hear stories by the stove. In the summer, its cool interior was a welcome respite from the heat. Barrow grew old. His muzzle turned a distinguished gray, his movements became slow and deliberate. He spent most of his days sleeping on his pile of blankets by the stove in the hearthhold, the place where he had always felt safest. One cold winter morning, 17 years after the Great White Death, Elias went to wake him,
and found that he had passed peacefully in his sleep. His great heart had simply stopped beating. Elias carried the old dog's body, wrapped in his favorite blanket, up the hill. He buried him in a spot overlooking the valley, beneath a tall pine tree. He carved a simple stone marker, Barrow, a loyal witness. He stood there for a long time, his hand on the cold stone, a silent farewell to the friend who had been with him from the very first shovel of frozen earth, the one believer he'd had from the beginning. More years turned. Elias's hair turned the color of snow. His children grew up and had children of their own. The valley prospered, its people secure in the knowledge that they were prepared for whatever fury the northern winters could throw at them. The hearthholds were a standard feature of every home, their grassy roofs dotting the landscape. The story of the boy who dug in the dirt became a local legend, a tale told to children to teach them the virtues of patience, preparation, and listening to the quiet wisdom of the earth. Elias lived to be 82 years old. He died as he had lived, quietly, in his own bed in the small cabin his father had built, with Alara holding his hand. The entire valley turned out for his funeral. They did not bury him in the churchyard. Instead, they carried him up the hill and laid him to rest beside his old friend Barrow, in the spot that overlooked the hearthhold and the community it had saved. They did not hire a stone carver from the city. The blacksmith's son, Alara's nephew, forged a set of fine chisels, and Mr. Gable's grandson, a man with a good eye for stone, carved the epitaph. They chose the words carefully, wanting to capture the essence of the quiet, stubborn man who had changed their world. They settled on a large, flat slab of granite, and on it they carved his name, his dates, and just below, the simple, declarative phrase he had uttered so many times, the words that were the foundation of his life and their legacy. The words that had been his answer to all doubt, all fear, and all impossibility. The stone read, Elias Wainwright, born 22 years before the Great White Death, died 60 years after it will work. Decades later, long after everyone who had known Elias was gone, another great storm rolled down from the north. The sky turned to iron, and the wind began to howl. But this time, there was no panic. Lights were checked, supplies were gathered, and families made their way, not with fear, but with a calm sense of purpose, to their hearthholds. In the original hold, the one Elias had built, a new generation of children gathered around the ancient stove, its iron belly glowing with warmth. They were safe, sheltered by the earth and the snow. An old woman, her face a map of wrinkles, pointed to the heavy oak door. This door, she told a wide-eyed little girl, was built by the man who taught us how to listen to the winter instead of shouting at it. Outside, the blizzard raged, throwing its full fury at the valley. And deep within the hill, buried beneath the storm, the community was warm, and the community was safe, anchored to the quiet legacy of the boy who dug a hole in the frozen ground. The structure stood. It was his final, silent, enduring word.